News story from Libya, where government officials have confirmed the death of Colonel Gadhafi. Now, the news comes from the city of Sirte, which has reportedly been overrun by government forces. And we have been looking at footage the last few hours and what appears to be footage of the wounded colonel being taken captive. Officials say Gadhafi had serious injuries to both his legs, but we've since heard from the National Transitional Council that the colonel later died from his wounds. One of Gadhafi's sons has also reportedly been killed in Sirte, but the influential Saif al-Islam, his eldest son, has reportedly been captured alive.
Well, let's get some analysis now from U.S.-based anti-war activist and journalist Don DeBar. Mr. DeBar, the killing of Gadhafi is being hailed by the West as a major victory, much like the killing of Osama bin Laden was. But is it really something to be celebrated at this point?
Well, first of all, hi, Tessa, thank you. First of all, the question is, did it actually happen? There are some reports. Mataba.net website, for example, says that Green committees in Libya say that he is safe and that he's not going to come out and poke his head out just because this announcement was made, but that he will be hearing from him. That may be true. Who knows? Assuming that he is dead, I'd say this reminds me more of when Saddam Hussein was captured rather than the supposed killing of Osama bin Laden, whose body's never been produced. And if you recall then, everyone thought this was on December 14th of 2003. The war in Iraq was supposed to be over shortly thereafter, and as we now know, that's about when it began. In Libya, you have a million weapons that were handed out to the people who have been governing themselves, by the way, through popular congresses, if you read the Green Book, for quite a long time. It's going to be interesting to see how now a government structure without bombing, because NATO says now the bombing can stop, how they're going to actually govern people and tell them what to do when they've been used to governing themselves in the main. And the last thing that's interesting about this is that the form that was used in Libya for a long time, and you can read about that in the Green Book, Part 1, Chapter 6 on popular congresses, is the same form that's springing up in 900 cities in the United States right now at the Occupy Wall Street events. And so you may see on the one hand, Gadhafi may well be dead, an uprising in Libya at some point in the near future, and perhaps Gadhafi's revenge in the United States as people begin self-government in the form that he laid out in the Green Book 30 years ago.
All right, well, we see this situation in Libya going one direction. But if Gadhafi had lived, for example, and would Gadhafi be standing trial at The Hague have been a better outcome for the people of Libya if he had been tried at the International Court?
Well, it would be interesting to have a trial because at a trial you have to produce evidence. And so the enabling charges at the time were that he was firing from the air on civilians. The Russian military has produced evidence that says that that wasn't true. They had satellite surveillance of the events that were specified in the evidence presented to the UN that enabled the resolutions 1970 and 1973. They said specifically, look, here's the satellite photography from that time. There was no aerial activity whatsoever. So a trial would have been good, I think, for everyone because there would have been a presentation of evidence. And even if the court was stacked, by the way, the United States doesn't recognize that court, but even if the court were stacked against Gadhafi, at least there would have been an open airing of evidence and people would have been able to make up their own minds about what had happened up to that point. So I think it would have been better, yes.
All right. Well, let's talk now about NATO's continuing military intervention. I mean, it had also said that their presence would continue even if and when Gadhafi's out of the picture. What do you think it will take to end this foreign presence in Libya?
Well, it seems actually, many people have characterized this as a popular uprising, but oddly, this popular uprising required NATO to bomb the hell out of Libya for 8 months. That wasn't necessary in Tunisia, and that wasn't necessary in Egypt, and in each of those two cases, the revolution took place inside of weeks. So I wouldn't characterize it that way at all. Rather, I would say that the entire episode is a foreign intervention and that NATO is well represented on the ground in the NTC, as apparently is al-Qaeda. And so I think going forward, as they attempt to engineer events on the ground, number one, as I said, they're going to have to contend with the response from the Libyan people who are armed and who are used to governing themselves. And number two, they're going to have to impose things to pay for the, I assume that NATO is there for a reason. One, they want to put a military base in Africa rather than base their African command from Stuttgart, because no African country would have it. And now they're active in Africa. You've had what happened in Cote d'Ivoire. You've had this. You have U.S. going into Uganda, the activity in Somalia. And so the first thing that you're going to see, I think, is a presentation of American forces, AFRICOM, NATO, whatever form it takes, trying to base itself in Libya, and a response from the Libyan people. And then there's going to be how the money that is brought into the country for oil is dispersed, because before it was used to build Libya from the poorest country in the world to one where everyone owned their home, had an education through the university level paid for, and health care. That situation, if that's not maintained and the reconstruction of the country isn't handled immediately, you're going to see a very long, protracted war, I think. And no matter what the intent is of NATO or the NTC, the fact is going to be that there's going to be turmoil there, and maybe even an ejection of these forces and a return of the prior situation.
Right. As you mentioned, reconstruction, I mean, it will be good for the Libyan people if it is done immediately, but the reality is it is a difficult and long process. Do you think the people of Libya can fend for themselves now that much of their infrastructure and defense capabilities have been destroyed, of course, by NATO bombings as well as the conflict inside? Do you think they're able to get out of this and really build their country again?
Well, they have the oil wealth to do that. Again, 42 years ago when Gadhafi took power, this was the poorest country on the planet. That includes all of the countries of Africa and South America and Asia. And they are far from that now. The UN report that was issued at the end of last year showed that the people of Libya had a standard of living comparable to that of the people in the so-called First World. So the wherewithal is there to reconstruct, certainly. That entire country hasn't been devastated, although it's been badly damaged. There is an infrastructure upon which to build. There's still the large water supply system that was constructed, for example, still exists in the main. Much of the oil capacity still exists. A lot of the housing stock still exists. And so, if the will is there, if the government's intent, if you're going to call the NTC now a government, if their intent is to do the repair, it can be done. If the repair isn't done, then there's something else operating, and I think the people there will wonder what that is.
All right. As always, thanks very much for your thoughts. Live from New York, they're talking to us anti-war activist and journalist Don DeBar. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. Take care.